He suspended them, but late last week he resurrected these military commissions, and not only that, but after releasing the Bush administration's memos about enhanced interrogations, well, he thought better than to release photographs of so-called detainee abuse. And then there's Afghanistan. During the campaign, Barack Obama continually insisted that the, quote, surge in Iraq was a failure, and yet that is exactly what he did when he sent 17,000 troops to Afghanistan in February. One can only conclude that this president has realized that governing is far more difficult than campaigning. And joining me tonight is the architect himself, Karl Rove, who has a column in the Wall Street Journal on this very issue. Karl, good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be with you.
You know, there's a part of me that says, okay, when he changes his mind and he starts doing things, especially on national security, I've been so nervous that he's going in the wrong direction and weakening our defenses. I'm glad. But I'm also fearful that his instincts are so bad.
Yeah. Well, look, we should applaud him. He's done the right thing in the instances that you talked about. In my column tomorrow, I add a couple more. You know, he's withdrawing troops from Iraq on a much longer time frame than he talked about during the campaign, and he says at the end of the period of withdrawal, we'll still have 50,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. That's much different than the impression he left during the campaign. But you're right to be concerned from this perspective. During the campaign, he made these rash promises in order to cultivate the support of the hard left of the Democratic Party, the MoveOn.org and Code Pink part of the Democratic Party. And as a result, during the primary, he was way out there to the left on national security questions. And once in office, the reality of governing is overwhelming what he said during the campaign. The opposite is true for the things that he said during the campaign in order to win the general election, which are things on the domestic front, from the deficit and debt and spending and going through the budget line by line and ending government programs that don't work and calling government-run health care extreme. All of these are things that during the campaign he said in the general election in order to curry support, which he's now flip-flopping on, going the opposite direction. And you're right, his instincts, at least on domestic affairs, are bad. On the international front, I think we're seeing an example of where the reality of being the President of the United States is changing things that he said during the campaign.
Well, what are we going to make about this week where, for example, the $80 million that the president requested to close Guantanamo Bay wasn't granted here? It seems to be to almost be a metaphor of the Obama administration, in as much as they care more about appearances. We're shutting this down. There's a change of the guard here. But then when the reality hits, they can't do it, and they don't even seem to care anymore.
Well, my column tomorrow, I talk about what the great University of Alabama historian Forrest McDonald called the projection of appealing images in a book called The American Presidency. He talked about how modern American presidents and modern American presidential candidates sometimes become too concerned with projection of these appealing images, so much so that the image itself becomes an end in and of itself. And I think we saw that during the campaign. He was trying to appeal to the Democrat left, the anti-war left, and he wanted to have the image of being the strident anti-war candidate, and as a result he adopted a series of positions without clearly thinking them through. And Gitmo is a key example. Look, the previous administration, the Bush administration, would love to have closed Gitmo, but there are so many thorny questions that we wrestled with for 3 or 4 years to which there are no easy answers. And we saw in this vote in Congress today, 6 Democrats voted to support the administration's position. Every Republican and all but 6 Democrats voted against the administration's position and basically said, we're not giving you the money until we understand with clarity what you were trying to do, and we don't want these people on U.S. soil.
Yeah. What do you make on economic policy? What do you make of what happened in California this week, which is the rejection of all these tax increases, especially in light of what Colin Powell had been saying in the context of the Republican Party, that, people now want bigger government. They're willing to pay for these services.
Look, people, particularly during a time of economic concern like we've got now, become more tax sensitive, not less, and particularly working class people in an environment like this become extremely sensitive about the idea of raising taxes. And look, California, those California voters knew what happened in California, and that is that the state government let spending get out of control over the last several years, dramatically blowing up the budget at a time when the state, when individuals in the state were having to rein in their own personal budgets. And so now the politicians are coming to him, led by the governor, and saying, geez, it's time for us to pony up now. It's time for you to spend a lot of money out of your family budget to repair the state budget. And the people said pretty significantly, no, we're not going to do that. And that's the problem that Barack Obama faces. All these domestic promises for which he's promising so much money. I mean, health care, the health care reform plan is estimated to cost between $1.2 and $1.5 trillion over the next decade. No idea where that money's coming from. He said, I've stockpiled $600 billion to help pay the cost of it. Well, that $600 billion is deficit. It's money that's added to the deficit. It's not coming from some tax source where he's setting it aside and lockboxing it like Al Gore kept talking about. Instead, it's $600 billion of additional debt. And this is why people are going to be very concerned when they start adding up the total.
Well, especially when you add up the numbers and the amount of money that we're putting and the debt that we're putting on our kids and grandkids. It's massive, it's overwhelming, and it's unsustainable. Newt Gingrich was on this program earlier this week, and he says Nancy Pelosi should step down. He said it's not about politics, it's about national security, and that is that the person who is number 2 in line to be the commander-in-chief cannot have contempt for the men and women who protect this country. Obviously talking about her saying the CIA is lying, her, not telling the American people the truth about what she knew and when she knew it.
Look, we've got several questions. A strong statement by Speaker Gingrich. We've got several big questions here. One is the question of credibility. Credibility. I've got this in a piece tomorrow in the Washington Post. Credibility is the currency of leadership, and right now it looks like she's lying. And if she's lying, her currency is being depleted. The second question is a question of equity. If Democrats keep talking about prosecuting and disbarring the attorneys, the Bush administration attorneys who described the permissible limits of interrogation, what about Nancy Pelosi, who was apprised of these limits and of these processes and said nothing? If it's good for one, it's got to be good for the other. If you're going to prosecute one, you got to prosecute the other. And the final one is, look, resolution. Let's be honest about this. She is the only person who has the view of events of the September 2002 briefing by the CIA of she, Porter Goss, and their 2 top aides. She's the only person who thus far has come forward with her version of it. We need to get this resolved. It is not good for our country. It's not good for our Congress. It's not good for her. It's not good for the CIA to have this question lingering out there. She ought to be under oath. Goss ought to be under oath. Their 2 aides ought to be under oath. The CIA briefers ought to be under oath. We ought to get a look at those CIA notes, and we ought to get this quickly resolved. What everybody is starting to think, given her pitiful performance last Thursday in her news conferences, she's lying, and we need to get this question resolved. It's a relatively simple question to get resolved. Let's find the venue and get it resolved.
Well, especially because the information, the contemporaneous notes are available from the CIA. Porter Goss's statement and her own aide statement contradict what she's saying, and she's had conflicting statements. All right, last question, and I want to go back to look at what we've got here. We've got now the government's going to take over GM. They've fired their CEO. They're giving debt holders of Chrysler a little money. They're implementing CAFE standards, so we'll be designing cars in D.C., not in Detroit any longer. You've got cap and tax or cap and trade that's going to cost the average family, estimates now about $3,000 a year. Is all of this get implemented, or are Democrats now fearful of Obama's radical agenda? Are they going to rein him in?
Well, I don't know if that's the case just yet, but look, all of this stuff has a long way to go before it actually all gets done. Some of it, like cap and trade and health care reform and these other bills. And there are a lot of big questions that Congress is going to have to grapple with. I do know this. People are starting to get really fed up with it. I mean, the idea that the United States government is going to do a fantastic job of running a major car company is ludicrous. Leave aside the question of where its authority to do a lot of the things that it's done so far come from. The idea that, the ordinary Americans looking at this and saying, look, they do an okay job on delivering the mail, but designing cars, selling cars, producing cars, they're not good at that. And this idea of an industrial policy of the government picking winners and losers and dictating, as in the case of the car companies, what kind of cars and what kind of models they're going to have is pretty ludicrous. And I think we saw it in the Tea Parties, backlash against the spending. I think we're going to see this grow over the next 6 to 9 months as American people become more aware of how radical this agenda is.
I think California also showed us a lot this week. Carl, good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me.